Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. If you're new here, what we do on this channel is talk about people who've had tragic or unfortunate ends to their life. Anyway, let's jump into today's video. On the 31st of January 1945, Edward Donald Slovik became the first US soldier to be executed solely for desertion since the American Civil War 80 years earlier. He was also the only US serviceman to be executed solely for deserting during the Second World War, despite the fact that over 20,000 others were convicted of the same crime between 1941 and 1945. So, what made Slovik's case exceptional, and why was he executed when others weren't? Edward Donald Slovik was born in Detroit in the state of Michigan on the 18th of February 1920. Slovik was born to Joseph and Anna Slowikowski, two members of the large Polish-American community in the upper Midwest of the United States. They had partially anglicized their surname to Slovik, and as a result, Edward was recorded as Slovik in his service record. Sadly, Edward had a troubled early life. He dropped out of school when he was just 15, and by then he had already amassed a criminal record for a range of petty crimes, such as theft, breaking and entering, and grand theft auto. By the time he reached his 21st birthday, early in 1941, he had been put on probation at least 5 times, and actually sentenced to 2 brief jail sentences. His backstory is significant. Well, Slovik's troubled criminal past would later have serious repercussions. Despite these early transgressions, after he was released from prison again in the spring of 1942, Edward was starting to straighten himself out. Shortly after his release, while working for Montella Plumbing in Dearborn in Michigan, he met Antoinette Wisniewski, a fellow Polish-American and a bookkeeper for the company. She was a good influence on him, and he then secured a job as a shipping clerk with the Chrysler Car Company, and they were married on the 7th of November 1942. Nevertheless, late the following year, his life would take a drastic turn. The United States had been directly involved in the Second World War since December 1941, following the Empire of Japan's assault on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It was US Army policy during much of the war not to draft individuals with criminal records, and as a result, it seemed like Slovik would never be called upon to serve in the military. Yet, as the conflict wore on in the Pacific Theatre, and the US prepared with its allies for the opening of a Western Front in Europe, the need for additional troops grew. Therefore, the restriction on those with criminal records serving was dropped. Hence, Slovik was discharged by the Michigan Parole Board in October 1943, and after being drafted into the army on the 3rd of January 1944, he set off for basic training a few weeks later. But little did he know that he would never again return to civilian life. Several months of basic training followed at Camp Walters in Texas. Slovik hated it, writing to his wife that it was worse than prison and that he intended to avoid going into combat at all costs. He failed in this though, and on the 25th of July 1944, he was dispatched to Europe, having been assigned to replace one of the servicemen who had been killed or wounded in the 109th Infantry Regiment during the initial weeks of the combat in France, following the D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944. Having arrived in France, Slovik quickly formed a friendship with one of the other replacements for the 109th Infantry Regiment, Private John P. Tanky. Tanky seems to have been as skeptical as Slovik about the idea of entering military combat. The two were soon separated from the other replacements they had been travelling with, and instead dug in with a Canadian unit away from the front lines, and with whom they spent 6 weeks in the autumn of 1944. During this time, they made themselves useful, driving trucks, cooking and guarding some German prisoners of war, who were being detained by the Canadian Division. Their failure to arrive to the 109th Infantry Regiment apparently went entirely unnoticed to begin with. It might have continued like this for the remainder of the war, had a new commander not arrived to oversee the Canadian division and became suspicious about the 2 Americans in his unit. As a result of his suspicions, he contacted the 109th Infantry Regiment, following which Slovik and Tanky were commanded to finally make contact with their actual regiment. Having arrived to the 109th Infantry Regiment in mid-October, Slovik immediately began seeking ways to avoid combat. These were not subtle. In his first days there, he asked his commanding officer, Captain Ralph O. Grott, if he could be court-martialed for having spent 6 weeks with the Canadians. When Grott said he would look into the matter, Slovik then asked him if it would be considered desertion if he left the regiment again. Grott told him he would be deemed to have deserted if he did so. It is important to get a clear sense of what Slovik was doing here. During the Second World War, over 20,000 US servicemen were tried and convicted of desertion. However, while desertion could theoretically be punished with the death penalty, the sentences for this crime were really usually quite mild. An individual might be discharged or given a record, but for Slovik, this would have been a limited threat, as he already had a considerable criminal record. Harsher penalties were reserved for individuals who committed graver offences. For instance, many US servicemen were given the death penalty and were in fact executed during the war, but these were for crimes such as rape or having committed civilian atrocities. No one was executed solely for desertion. Slovik would have been aware of this in the autumn of 1944, as he plotted to desert, and it would have informed his actions. Captain Grott tried to stop Slovik by imploring his friend Tanky to intercede with him, but this proved fruitless. Consequently, on the 9th of October, the day after Slovik and Grott's conversation, Edward Donald Slovik left the 109th Infantry Regiment. He then handed in a confession to a cook in the 112th Military Government Department nearby, admitting what he had done in absconding to the Canadian unit in August, and his most recent desertion from the 109th Infantry Regiment that morning. In the hours and days that followed, he was offered numerous opportunities to stop what he was doing, with promises that he would be transferred to a new division without any repercussions. These he refused, believing a brief jail sentence awaited him, and that this was preferable to actual combat. It was a fateful decision. Slovik was charged with 2 counts of desertion on the 19th of October. Again, 10 days later, he was once more offered a chance to abandon his resistance to service and return to his unit. He refused yet again. Slovik was then psychiatrically evaluated to make sure he was sound of mind before being put on trial. That trial eventually began on the 11th of November and lasted just over an hour, with Slovik's attorney, Captain Edward P. Woods, making almost zero effort to defend his client. The prosecution brought several witnesses directly from the front lines to better remind the court of the kind of service that Slovik was refusing to undertake. As a result, the judges found the defendant guilty and unanimously voted to have him executed by firing squad. The trial on the 11th of November, though, was not the end of the judicial deliberations. The decision had to be reviewed by an appellate court, and as we have seen, convictions solely for desertion within the US military never ended in execution during the Second World War. But when the sentence was reviewed on the 27th of November 1944, in a bizarre twist, the sentence of execution by firing squad was upheld. Slovik now realised the extent of the danger that he was in. One last review remained, to be undertaken by General Dwight Eisenhower, one of the Allies' senior commanders in Europe. Slovik wrote to the future US President in early December, claiming he was ignorant of the severity of his crimes when he committed it, and imploring the general to consider Slovik's wife back home in Michigan. But it was no use. On the 23rd of December 1944, Eisenhower confirmed the sentence and the decision to execute Slovik. Edward Donald Slovik was executed on the morning of the 31st of January 1945 in northeastern France by a firing squad of 12 men from the 109th Infantry Regiment. Before his execution, Slovik revealed his own thoughts about why he was being executed. Here he claimed that he was being made an example of, to reduce the amount of desertion which was occurring in the ranks of the US troops in Western Europe in the winter of 1944 to 1945. Well, as someone with a checkered past and a lengthy criminal record, Slovik was viewed as expendable. There is much to support his argument. Desertion levels in France at this time had increased considerably in the US ranks, as a German counter-offensive in the Ardennes forest that winter, generally known as the Battle of the Bulge, led to increasing Allied casualties. As such, it seems plausible that a decision was taken to execute a deserter to serve as an example to others who were considering deserting. Slovik was the man chosen to be made an example of. He said to the men who came to execute him on the morning of the 31st of January, "They just need to make an example out of somebody, and I'm it, because I'm an ex-con. I used to steal things when I was a kid, and that's what they are shooting me for. They're shooting me for the bread and chewing gum I stole when I was 12 years old." The execution was carried out with Slovik tied to a post in a garden, surrounded by a wall in the village of Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines. Of the 12 men in the firing squad, one was given a blank bullet, but all the other 11 hit Slovik in the first round of shots. None of the bullets, though, pierced Slovik's heart, and it took some moments for him to die from the wounds. Edward Donald Slovik's body was subsequently buried in a nearby Voisin American cemetery. In an indignity, he was buried along with dozens of other US soldiers who had been executed for more severe crimes, including rape and civilian murders. Owing to their crimes, individuals in this section of the cemetery were not given headstones with their names on, but simply a plaque bearing a number. This would cause Edward's widow, Antoinette, considerable distress, and she tirelessly spent the next 35 years until her own death in 1979, petitioning successive US presidents to allow her husband's remains to be disinterred and brought home to the United States. Sadly, she never lived to see this dream realized, but Slovik's remains were finally brought home and laid next to Antoinette's in 1987. Slovik's story has been related in several prominent ways since his death. Two should be noted here. In 1969, Kurt Vonnegut, the great anti-war writer, featured Slovik in his magnum opus Slaughterhouse-Five. Then 5 years later, in 1974, a film entitled The Execution of Private Slovik was released, starring Martin Sheen and his son Charlie in one of his first roles. These are just two instances of how Edward Donald Slovik's story has been related since his death. Pieces which indicate that his execution for desertion in January 1945 was a major injustice for a crime which was almost never punished in this fashion. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this video on Edward Slovik. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to have notifications turned on so you get all my videos as soon as they're uploaded. And if you have any suggestions, you can leave them down in the comments, or you can find the link to my email and Instagram in the description, which I also check. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next unfortunate end. Thanks.